Oh gosh, that's a big question. Um, Originality and honesty. I think, if you're writing from the heart, I think that that's the most important thing to have first. And then after that, you can finesse it. You can edit it to death. I edit my stuff, over and over and over again until it gets to where, I want it to be. But if it's not from an honest place, to start with, then I think that you're in trouble. Then it often is even harder. It's harder to get it to flow. So, stick with your guns, like stick with your perspective and your political, your integrity, regardless whether what you're saying is controversial or frowned upon at the time. It makes it easier if it matters to you. The hardest things to write are the ones you just don't care about. So the more you care, the easier it'll be, even if it seems unusual or weird or what have you. Oh yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, honestly, sometimes it's just one of those things where you feel like you're stuck forever, and then you're somewhere where you're nowhere near your computer. You're like, in the shower, out for a walk, and that's when it comes to you. So one thing I advise is, I mean, I guess you probably all carry your phones, but bring your phones or a notebook or something because that's when the flash of inspiration might come. The other thing is if you're truly blocked to read, read just anything. It doesn't have to do with what you're writing, because that just sort of frees up your mind. It gets used to somebody else's kind of flow and style. And so that might just help you click into place because staring at that cursor like on a blank screen is enough to drive you insane, make you feel insecure, make you feel so worried. And the worry, itself can block you. The other thing is just don't be afraid to screw up. Like no one's going to see the first version. And if you're in a class where, your professor does see the first version and they're there to help you, then that's a good thing. But, it's between just you and yourself. And it's all right to have whole things that you're going to end up deleting later, the parts that you don't like the way that they're phrased the first time around. That's a very normal, natural part of the process. And it's a frustrating part of the process, but you get used to it over time. That's a great question. It's what I'm really struggling with right now because there are things that I want to write about, but they're so dark and scary, even by the standards of which I write, which Brian will tell you are pretty dark. And I feel like sharing them publicly is not necessarily the right thing to do. If I have some sort of information that's relative, relevant to the public good, I always do share it immediately if I think it's going to be helpful. This isn't quite that. This is more, ruminations on things. So sometimes I end up writing things and then publishing them later if I feel like it's not quite as traumatizing. But lately, since I've been running my own newsletter, meaning I have full editorial control over what topics and how I want to present them, I've often just written things that are what I am most drawn to at the time and what I can handle. And because the political situation is so dark right now, they're often woven into stories of something else. They're woven into travel logs or they're woven into kind of a memoir style of writing. And I didn't need to have to do that in the past with certain, because the topics either weren't quite as dark or they were affecting regions that I was studying that were very far away, places like Uzbekistan. And obviously, it would still affect me emotionally. It would still upset me emotionally. But it's different when your own life is in danger and when your country's in danger. Like, I feel the need to kind of not soften it, but kind of expand the world around it so that so the reader doesn't feel like they're getting hit on the head with a sledgehammer or something, so that there's beauty in the words, in the language itself, and something surprising and something original, so that people will want to read it again and again. I think of it more like writing a song. Like people will listen to a depressing song over and over and over, and the depressing song will make you feel better because it makes you feel one that you're not alone, that the songwriter and singer understands your pain, but also it's a new and original way of conveying that emotional state or discussing that topic. And that can expand your mind instead of closing it and shutting it down. And so that's more what I'm trying to do with the pieces I'm writing lately is write things that will stand up over time. And that maybe, even if they're dark in terms of the topic or even in terms of the language, bring some comfort because the hardest thing about feeling sad is feeling like you're all alone with that sadness. And there's a quote from James Baldwin where he says, so I'm paraphrasing, but I felt that I was, alone with my torment, and no one had ever felt any of the things I felt before. And then I began to read, and it was through reading that he realized so many people had felt the same things, and that proved a great comfort to him. You would think it would be the opposite, but it's not. Knowing other people have been in your place before and managed to go on and managed sometimes to win, in terms of overcoming political difficulties and so forth, can be a very reassuring thing. Honestly, I think it's just the way I speak or think, and it just sort of flows out of me at this point, and there's no other, I'm not thinking, oh, I'm going to use a simile here, like it's not as contrived as that. It's just whatever seems right. Sometimes those lines, like the lines that are more poetic or more interesting, are the first ones I write, and I don't even know what the essay is going to be about. And I end up, often they come to me if I wake up in the middle of the night, it'll be in my head. And then I just ended up sending a weird note to myself that I find the next day, and I'm like, "What the hell is this?" But those lines will eventually land somewhere. It might not be on what I work on next. Like I have like a sort of open document of just random fragments or sort of turns of phrases that I like. So yeah, it's a bit random, and but sometimes though, like the best lines come in the end, like after I've edited this thing 30 times. I mean, which is on average like how many times I go through a piece before I publish it in my newsletter. I have kind of a first draft. If my husband's around and is willing to do it, he'll look through it to kind of give me an overall perspective and also just check for typos. I mean, one thing that's stressful about editing your own stuff is there's no one to just catch basic mistakes, and I want to make sure I don't have those. But then as I'm writing, I'm reading sort of the draft that's online. Things will come to me and I'll add them in. And I just noticed sometimes from the online reaction, like the lines that are quoted are sometimes the ones that came in at the end. And I think it's because at that point, I've absorbed the piece so much. I'm so sick of it. Like I never want to read it again. But it's, become so much a part of me that things evolve from it and they just end up in there. And then I always feel lucky. Like I honestly don't feel like I'm writing it. I feel like it's getting written through me and I'm just like the channel and it's coming out. And those are the ones that are the best, and the worst ones are the ones that feel like pulling teeth. Like they just feel like this torturous process where I'm kind of forced to write something and I'm not in the mood, which happens to all of us. Oh my gosh. I don't know. I mean, because there's different things that I read and reread, for different reasons. Like I always read the book Ghost Story by Peter Straub. It's a novel that I first read when I was 12, and I read it every year. And it has a mystery at the core that I've never fully understood the whole depth of the mystery. And now he's died, so I'll never fully know the answer. But honestly, I would never want to fully know the answer. So, this is a Peter Straub is an author, often he's like the highbrow Stephen King. He sometimes co-wrote with Stephen King, but he's a little more fancy. But anyway, there's something about that book that just brings me back. I mean, I guess this question threw me off guard. So this is the first thing that popped into my head. But if I've read the same book every year for 34 years, then there's got to be something to it. There are also, poets and others who I go back to just purely because of the language, because I'm studying how they put language together. But I read very broadly. I mean, I read a lot of really like stuff that would be described as extremely lowbrow and irrelevant. Like I have a subscription to the print version of People magazine that I refuse to surrender. And, so I'm really reading just like all over the place. I like to read stuff by people from foreign countries when those countries are being discussed in our media to make sure that I have a firsthand perspective of what's going on there. And that's not being filtered through our journalistic system, which often censors or shapes certain narratives. So really, like I'm all over the map, and I encourage you to be all over the map. And just, it doesn't matter if the stuff is being labeled as, trashy or lowbrow, like mix it up with like the highbrow, difficult stuff and enjoy the process, like enjoy the process of reading. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the thread that kind of will, you know, these things together is exploitation and abandonment, which go hand in hand. I mean, the title itself in the first essay, the fact that it's the view from flyover country is meant to counter that abandonment that I think is felt regardless of what your background is. If you're from this region, it's a weird thing to look back because I wrote these essays now more than a decade ago, and so much has changed. And that abandonment has been extremely successfully exploited by political parties in a way that is just catastrophic. And I wish had been addressed back then. But it's also something that I think a lot of Americans are experiencing a great deal of hurt, and all of these issues of mistrust or arguments over, disinformation, or things like that. They come from that place of being abandoned. Like, for example, when people were reluctant to take the COVID vaccine in Missouri and they got labeled as crazy and blah, blah, blah. A lot of that was because these are people who, lived through the opioid epidemic and were very recently told, that this was safe, this was not addictive, this would be fine, and then watched their communities become ravaged and then were completely abandoned in the aftermath while the companies that did this to them got away with it. And that also happens on an environmental level. It happens with mining corporations or other, polluters, and people just lived through a lot of pain. And I think that makes them right for exploitation on a psychological level and an economic level. And to be aware of that, to be aware that that's happening, but still feel powerless, is a recipe for both authoritarianism, and sometimes for vigilante violence, as we're starting to see. I guess one thing to know, and I think I say this in the intro of the book, is that this was not intended to be a book. I was writing essays on a sort of semi-weekly basis for Al Jazeera online. And then when I stopped doing that, I had a lot of requests from my readers of, is there a way I could get all these in one place? And because I owned the copyright, I just self-published a book about it. And so, I didn't think of it as like, oh, now I'm entering this particular topic or this field, and now I'm going to have to cover this painful thing. I mean, the most difficult part of writing it was that, many of these essays warned of things or sort of were approaching topics that, now they're very mainstream. Like if you talk about economic exploitation or you talk about, the plight of adjunct professors in academia or low wage workers, or just lack of opportunity, like that's a pretty common topic. Everyone will acknowledge those things happen. Back then, there was still just this really adamant response of no, you're just a weak, you're a failure, it's your fault. Like when people would say, like, I can't find a job or I can't pay my bills or things are too expensive, very basic things. And so dealing with that, dealing with the sort of gaslighting of it and knowing that I would encounter it the minute it was published, it was a little frustrating, but I also heard a lot of things, that they felt vindicated, that they felt like they weren't going crazy, that there really was a systematic problem and it wasn't just them, so that made it worth it. But it's always tough to write about painful things. I mean, honestly, one of the hardest ones to write was the last one I wrote, I think, which is about Ferguson, because it was in the middle of it. And I felt honestly like I wasn't emotionally up for writing that, but also like I had an obligation to because I live here. And so many people writing about this did not live here and were just getting it wrong and writing things that I thought were either just they were inaccurate or they were offensive on kind of an emotional level. They were taking real human beings and treating them like props. And I wanted to write something to counter that. And so I did that. But I remember at the time thinking, geez, like this is the last thing I feel like doing. I was thinking of my children and I was thinking of their friends, and I was, it was a very immediate thing. There were particular kids, that I envisioned, kids who were at the time were like maybe my daughter was in second grade, 6 or 7 years old. And I feared, for their lives living here. I feared that they would end up like Michael Brown. And now my daughter, is the same age as he was and her friends are. And watching them face these exact same issues. And so, it was a emotional thing because, it's scary to sort of forecast or fear that kind of outcome for anybody. So, that came from a place kind of more of as a mom and as a citizen of St. Louis than as a writer looking objectively from above. And I kind of just wanted to bring that point home, and I live in a mixed race neighborhood. And I think, I mean, it's been a while since I've read my own book, but I think I have a line of, you could live right next door to somebody and have a completely different life than them, be treated completely differently by authorities and institutions and strangers. And they won't know, and you won't know how you each feel about that unless you directly converse about it. And what Ferguson did is, it did cause a lot of those conversations. And at the time, briefly, some kind of sense of empathy and understanding. And I was hoping that that sense of empathy would stay. It's kind of gone back and forth. I would encourage people to continue to cling to it, regardless that we live in this backlash era. Yeah, that was a tough one to write. Just because it was so personally bound. I'm glad that essay is resonating seemingly with many of you, especially because you all would have been quite young when that event occurred, right? Learning about it more secondhand through direct witnessing. And so one thing I've always worried about with Ferguson, especially because a lot of people who protested there have since died, they died young, is that it will be forgotten. I thought around the 10th anniversary that there would be a lot of coverage of that, of like, how has St. Louis changed? What kind of reforms have been made to make people's lives better? It's like they want to just bury it. And I was in Tulsa recently, and I was visiting the site of the Black Wall Street Massacre, which happened in 1921. And a lot of people just didn't know about it until the centennial anniversary rolled around. And I wondered to myself, is that going to be what Ferguson's like? Are they just going to block out that there was a civil rights uprising that then spurred a national, civil rights uprising in the way it did? Because I think people did something very significant, whether it succeeded or not. It changed the course of American history. I think it did make people find, strength, and also be very aware of what kind of problems we have in our system, and the extent that we need to fix them and remedy them. I feel like I've still not recovered from that crash. And it's dawning on me that my daughter is like the same age as you guys, roughly. She was 1 year old when it happened. I remember we were building a little alphabet block tower, and it crumbled when my husband came home and told me turn on the TV. It's not like the economy in America was ever great, but you can look at graphs of wealth gaps, between the, extremely wealthy people and average medium income and stuff like that. And you see this enormous, enormous acceleration starting around 2000, but really after 2008, where all of the wealth of the middle class and the lower class gets put into the absolute upper, echelon. And in 2011, there was Occupy Wall Street, which was a movement against that, the slogan, "We are the 1%," to emphasize that there's this billionaire class. But what's wild is you look at how much money people had in 2011, those billionaires, it's like chump change compared to what billionaires have now. They're like nearly trillionaires now. And so it becomes harder and harder to fight something like that. But it was just a sense of, I was almost 30 years old. I had a child. I felt like a full grown adult. And it felt like just the rug being pulled out from under me, like any future I had envisioned, I knew it was gone. And there's something really scary about economic futures versus sort of more abstract political topics, even if those are very scary. Like something like 9/11 obviously scared me a lot. I lived in New York City when it happened, so bad, obviously. But when it's economic, you need to feed your kid, you need to pay your rent, you need to get by on a day-to-day basis. And it's going to affect you every single day. And I've never felt safe, even as someone with like best-selling books or whatnot. Like I've never had that sense of precarity leave me. And I think that's true of my generation and of folks older than me, and even of the baby boomer generation. A lot of times people assume they're all wealthy, they had it easy. Their retirement money, a lot of it was lost in that, not necessarily gained back. And I think it put folks in a sort of sense of, kind of constant wariness. My grandparents grew up in the Great Depression. And a lot of times when I'm talking to my children, I realize how much I sound like my grandma, who was a child in the 30s and who was terrified of, didn't trust banks, putting money in the mattress, like was so cheap that she'd take the light out of the refrigerator, when she wasn't using it so that it wouldn't waste electricity when she opened the door. Stuff like that. Like you just get in this mode of extreme, you're very, very conservative with how you spend your money because you just assume it could all vanish in the blink of an eye. And that sense never quite went away. So yeah, that sense I think is all throughout flyover country because of that sense of abandonment and exploitation. Because when people feel that way, when they feel like anything could be taken away in a heartbeat, it can be easier to control them and to change their values. And that's why it's very important to know your own values and write them down and hold on to them, regardless of people's attempts to sway you towards something that you don't want to do. Yeah, it's I have a line from my last book from my book They Knew where I say something like because Americans did not learn from history, history is repeating itself all at once. Because there's so many terrible episodes of our past, whether the Civil War, or the fascist movements of the 1930s, or the Spanish flu, or even like the war in Afghanistan. They're just in Iran Contra and Watergate, on and on it can go that have repeated themselves just within the last like 8 years. Like they have repeated themselves within, my youngest child's lifetime, and he's only 14 years old. And I just think about all he's lived through versus what I lived through by age 14. And it's like, it just dwarfs everything, like most kind of major events of my lifetime, I would say took place within the last 14 years, and it's been a grim time. So the thing is it doesn't have to, it doesn't need to repeat itself. And honestly, I'm more afraid to some degree of the future of unprecedented things related to digital technology, related to all these tech oligarchs, people like Elon Musk, and surveillance, societies, and our ability to have smartphones and record each other and spy on each other. Like, I think we've lost things that we took for granted for a very long time, like our privacy when we walk around, and it's created a new kind of a new way of interacting with each other and a lot of psychological distress that I think is new. It's also eroded to some degree the concept of the nation state, which is the fundamental concept that like everyone alive had lived with up until now. So I don't think history is going to completely repeat itself. Climate change, is another thing that brings this novel element to it. Unfortunately, I think these new problems are exacerbating the problems that we never dealt with as a nation. And therefore, that is what, tends to come up again and again. Like when there's a new crisis, it is almost always the same marginalized groups that are hit most intensely and hit first, because America refuses to reckon with the sins of its past. It kind of was for a little while, like say, 2019, 2020. And then there's a big backlash to that reckoning. And that's the backlash we're living in now. And so that frightens me a bit. I think we're losing it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the
Yeah.
goal of it's different. Like I think, there were many terrible things the American government was doing during the Great Depression and after, even though FDR did a lot of good things, he also was putting Japanese people in internment camps. But I think the goal of their policies was to make America great, for lack of a better phrase. I really should find a better phrase. They wanted America to be powerful. They wanted Americans to be prosperous, to thrive, to get education, to get jobs, to feel, some kind of safety in their own communities, etc. Not all Americans, they weren't very concerned with Black Americans. They weren't very concerned with Native Americans. They often treated immigrants terribly. So this is not some sort of like glory era, like a lot of people remember it. But in terms of like, where are we as a nation? They wanted us to be on top. Right now, I think they kind of want us to be on not the bottom, but be in a place where they can just scrape everything apart, grab what they want, and then the rest of us are just kind of these people living there that are in the way. And I think a lot of folks aren't used to being treated like that. And a lot of folks don't understand that when you look at American history, you will absolutely see people treated like that. Like that is how Native Americans were treated. That is how Black Americans were often treated. It's not necessarily new. It's new in the sense that it's kind of almost everybody is being treated like they're disposable, except for a very tiny group of people. And they don't care if we fall nationally. Like if our international reputation is ruined, they absolutely do not care. They just care about money and power and how to get it. And the whole idea of America, the great superpower, they don't treasure that. They used to fight for that in the worst way often, like something like the Iraq War was an example of them fighting for that idea. They don't even care about it anymore, and that almost puts us in a more danger. It does put us in a more dangerous situation than we were with Iraq and with other bad decisions that the government made. Well, kleptocracy, the roots of it come from klepto means to be a thief, to steal. Anything that you see as in cracy is power. So, like democracy is the power of the people, and kleptocracy is the power of the thieves. It's a form of government meant to, strip the country down, sell it off for parts. A mafia state, essentially, run by thieving criminals. Plutocracy is, a sort of extreme abuse of power. Autocracy is the power of one individual, and that's more what authoritarianism is like. And we have elements of all of these things happening right now in our government, which is why I'm bringing them all up. It's not just pick one. It's really like you've got bits of all of them. Kleptocracy, I think, is the main one. With Trump this time around, I've always said, focus on the network. Don't just focus on one individual. This time, I'm not even sure if it's his own idea, but he's taking more of a traditional dictator route in terms of wanting to, for example, buy Greenland, expand the states, take over Canada, annex it. Those are typical 20th century dictator moves. Whereas his goal the first time around, and I think this unfortunately still is his goal, was to collapse the country, because his loyalty is not to the United States, it's just to his money and his backers' money, and all of these other kind of white collar and mafia criminals that surround him. So I would still say focus on the network, which is why kleptocracy is more useful. It's not just about the individual. I think people who float the sort of strongman theory of politics, meaning everything around one guy who calls the shots, are wrong. We obviously know they're wrong because, like Elon Musk, a private citizen, has now infiltrated the treasury. So if that's happening, it's clearly not just one person causing these problems. It's very, very powerful, very wealthy, very immoral people together causing these problems. No, I mean, I'm not aiming for anyone to do anything. Like I think everyone has the right to whatever emotion they want. Like, I just want people to feel what they naturally feel, and I'm certainly not trying to provoke anybody to feel, despair. I mean, when I read about something that's very sad or unjust, I feel that. Like I spent a lot of my life before I switched to covering the United States, covering dictatorships in Central Asia. And so, that would provoke an emotional reaction in me, but it was sort of the natural one of like, well, that's horrible. Like, I wish that would stop for the sake of the people who live there and have to endure these circumstances. But I mean, I'm just writing, the way I write about topics that themselves happen to be very dark. I think I sometimes get folks who are like, why don't you write something happier? And I'm kind of alarmed. I'm like, well, if I'm happy about the burgeoning fascism, like that's actually not good. Like then you should really be worried. If I'm like, ooh, yay, everybody, like we're heading into an authoritarian kleptocracy. Like get out your pom poms. Like I'm not quite sure what people expect. When I was really young, when I was a teenager, I used to write for this magazine called Fangoria. That was a horror movie magazine, and it was like extremely violent, bloody, and it had all these like pictures of like Freddy and Jason and all the murder victims and whatnot. Fictional horror, fictional blood. But anyway, I always get all these letters from people that were like, "My God, I cannot believe when I picked up my magazine, like what I saw." And I'm always thinking, like, literally a horror movie magazine. Like, what do you think was going to be in it? Like, why aren't you reading like Better Homes and Garden or something? Like, well, this is your problem. This is not our problem. And that's kind of how I feel now when people are like, "Why aren't your fascism stories more upbeat?" I'm like, because I have a conscience. So, and I don't know. Oh yeah. It's backlash. I feel lucky. Backlash, I'm fine with. Like, if people disagree with me, if they don't like me, like that's their right. And I think it would be really creepy and weird if everyone did like me and was just bowing down all the time. Like that's fascism. Like, that would freak me out. What I don't like are threats, like to my physical safety, and that kind of a thing, which I unfortunately have had to deal with, and has gotten worse in the last 8 years for a mysterious reason. I'm sure you cannot possibly guess. And so, obviously, it worries me most when it comes to threats to my family, to my children. It's been interesting to raise two kids in this time, and now they're older, they're more self-sufficient, so I'm a little less worried, I guess. But yeah, it goes with the territory. I think any writer should expect that you're going to get this, and often, if you're female, you'll get it more. If you're not white, you'll get it more. There are biases that they're not reading what you write. They just see the byline or they see your photo and their mind is made up about your worth before they read a word that you say. And my response to that is like, screw them, write it anyway, do it anyway, because your voice matters and it needs to be heard. It's just something to kind of keep in mind that this is a very common thing, and don't take it that personally. Don't assume that their critique has any merit if that's the place that it's rooted in, if it's rooted in racism or misogyny or what have you. I mean, if it's a thoughtful critique, then I will engage with it and talk to them and, hopefully have some sort of like civil debate. If they're really vicious or horrible, or honestly, my main thing is like if they didn't read the essay, and they're kind of just making things up, or they're asking me a question that's answered in the essay, like give an example of that where I have like 3 paragraphs of examples. Then I'm like, I'm not dealing with this. I'm not going to waste my time. So I basically just take the ones that are in good faith and I try to answer them the best I can, try to find some common ground, and I ignore the ones that seem either trollish or just very sloppy. No, sometimes I regret not pushing back harder against editors that like whittled down what I was saying to something that I think made it worse. But I don't really have any regrets. I sometimes regret not going full throttle and writing, so it goes the other way in the end. It's weird now because so many of the articles that I cited have first of all just been deleted, or the publication went out of business, or so on and so forth. And so, like, that book is now like the sole record of a lot of events that occurred.
Wow.
And, at one point it was nearly pulled out of circulation right after Trump got Supreme Court immunity. I got notified that it was being pulled out of circulation forever. And I fought back because at that point it was also like number 2000 on Amazon. And I was like, there's no way you can justify this to me and pretend that people aren't interested. And now that it's selling, I don't know. It really depends on whether profit incentive will win out over political desire to censor me. So we'll see what happens to that book. But it's scary to be kind of like one of the last ones standing, because a lot of the people who covered what I covered have since just quit completely. I feel like it was like less dangerous when it originally came out, even though it was talking about a lot of very frightening topics, because the political opposition was stronger, and there were a lot of other journalists interested in the topics of, say, financial corruption. Little sort of things I mentioned in passing, like Deutsche Bank. There'd be an entire book about Deutsche Bank. That does not happen anymore. Hiding in Plain Sight would never get published now. Neither would books like Ronan Farrow's Catch and Kill or Tom McNeil's Chaos. All those books that were coming out in like 2029. I mean, I'm sorry, 2019, in that era, they would all be canceled. They would all be killed before they reached readers, which is, I think, why so many writers are moving to Substack versus traditional publishing. They're just scared of litigation. I mean, that's what it is that Trump has billions of dollars. It's honestly not just Trump. Trump and a lot of other people have billions of dollars and teams of unethical lawyers. And it's not even that they would win, because their arguments would be spurious, but that they would drain my life and my publisher's life dry. They would drain the coffers in the legal battle. Like, that's how they fight these things. So, and
No, that
that's
makes
like
sense.
a fight most people don't want to wage. I don't know exactly why, but in Germany, it's a censored book because of those Epstein
Wow.
documents. And I remember a woman interviewed me from a German newspaper, and we had a great interview. And then she called me back and she was crying. And she said, in 25 years, writing in Germany, I've never once been told that I have to censor my own work. And so she ended up publishing it in some other paper in some other country, the same interview. But she wasn't able to explain why they were censoring it. She didn't know. She said they wouldn't tell her. She just said that because of the Epstein stuff, it can't run in Germany. And I'm like, okay, so this is interesting. Which is one of the reasons there's no translation of that book in Germany, even though it's extremely popular with German readers. So, that's just how the breaks. Like in 2020, it was like, when the book came out, I was doing interviews all over the world. And, it was a cool lady, cool writer, and felt bad for her. I also felt bad for me. So, yes, I have. I mean, publishing is a complicated business because you're working with a lot of different people with a lot of different agendas. And so, say my editor might be cool with what I'm writing and might be supportive. And then it goes to, the corporate side of the publisher, and also the marketing people, and especially legal review, which is a very rigorous process if you're writing about political people who are alive. I do a lot of embroidery and stuff, and I once made a little cross stitch that said "the dead can't sue," which is why there are so many crimes discussed in They Knew involving people who have passed away versus the living people of hiding in plain sight, because it was a nightmare dealing with that. I initially had a lawyer who seemed to have a good acquaintance with a lot of. I have to be very careful how I say this because she's lawyer. Seemed to have some kind of fondness for some of the more villainous people of the book, and perhaps knew them personally, although I don't know that quite for sure. Anyway, wanted to axe like whole chapters, wanted to gut them, and then decided to do that like right before it was going to go to press. So there was a bit of a brawl. I won the brawl. And so, it went to press, but yeah, I had a new lawyer for my next two books. He was great. So it's not always a terrible process. Like often the lawyers are very good. I just sort of had a situation on my hands. So there's that, and just dealing with folks who don't quite understand you. I found as a writer living in St. Louis, I'm somewhat of a rarity in that I write about national politics, and almost everyone who does that lives in New York or DC. And they really are in this bubble where they have a lot of stereotypical and cliched views of what the rest of the country is like. And so just trying to convince them that something we see every day is happening or real, whether it's a terrible law that was passed or just a general sense of abandonment or disillusionment in the population, would be a struggle. A lot of the times I would just hear, this is early. I mean, now everyone admits that, things are fine, things are great, so and so is going to win. Don't worry about that crazy situation. And I'd be like, I swear to you, I'm telling the truth. I'm not exaggerating. I don't want attention. Like, this is not about that. I'm talking about a serious criminal problem, crime within the government. And it was often difficult to get people to take that seriously because they kind of assumed, well, if I know about it, sitting here with my laptop in St. Louis, then clearly more powerful people than me know about it, and they'll intervene and they'll stop it. And I'm like, well, yeah, they do know about it. They don't care about stopping it. And thus lies the problem. And that's why the book's called Hiding in Plain Sight, because like even I can see it. It's also why it's called They Knew, because they knew. Yeah, that's a great question because a lot of it has to do with how technology has evolved since I started writing these, and also just sort of how internet culture changed. When I started writing in 2012, 2013, the kind of routine, extreme hostility and hatred expressed by strangers on the internet towards each other was more unusual. It hadn't become something that people just expect. It would be very unusual if you were attacked by an army of, say, bots. Also, there were no bots, like this whole thing of AI and fake people being able to be deployed to all scream at you or harass you at once. Like that wasn't a thing that happened. And so it was kind of a less scary environment to write about these heated topics. As technology developed, as there was no kind of oversight, and as people got used to treating each other in really terrible ways that I think they often would not do face to face, but they feel fine doing on the internet, it became tougher. And especially because the other thing the internet did is it eroded privacy. And I always wrote under my real name. I didn't have a pseudonym or something. So when I wrote something, it was easy to find my address and my phone number and, figure out where my children go to school and all of that. And so when you add all that up, that's a distressing thing. What I found to be the most useful strategy is just to be completely honest all the time. Even if people don't like what you're saying, if you mean what you say and you're not hiding things, then I think not like you win, but you keep your integrity intact, and you keep your sense of self intact, and that will get you, through a lot of this. Because what a lot of folks want to do is sort of like, find some sort of evil secret hypocrisy within you. And if you don't have one, then they're not going to find it. And you ultimately will come out on top. It just, it's a painful process to go through nonetheless. But, I still would encourage folks. It's just sort of like steer yourself. It's like, I don't know, mountain climbing or any kind of like dangerous sport. Like there's a big reward in the end, but you've got rough going in the beginning and you should expect it. Yeah, I mean, I've been worried about the future for for a long time. And honestly, I think one of the more optimistic things is that it's now going on 9 years of me, worrying quite, voraciously about the future. And yet I am still here able to speak about it and speak freely to a large degree, certainly more than many countries. So there's still, some hope and opportunity there. I do think we've entered a newer, darker era. I think a lot of it has to do with technology and the ability of, oligarchs and plutocrats, really wealthy people to control how we communicate, to be able to surveil our lives. And, one thing that was good about the last decade is I feel like a lot of people became more attuned to our history, to America's history, to the world's history, and more honest about, I mean, the word in my head is sins. Like mistake doesn't really cover it. When you think about slavery or Jim Crow or Native American genocide or illegal invasions abroad or all sorts of things we've done, and that the goal should be to learn from them, to remedy them, to try to seek some sort of form of redemption. We're now in the other way, where I think people feel like that's impossible. So they instead just cling to power wherever that power lies. And that power lies often with the people carrying out evil acts. And so that's something that I fear for, but I almost, one of the more distressing things I see is not so much bad people with a lot of money and power doing bad things, because that's always been there and that's, expected. It's more when I see people surrender their own compassion and empathy for the victims of the people doing the bad things, and they decide to either join that side or to blame people who really don't have a lot of power, who are in a weakened position to begin with. I see a lot of that, and I hope that that stops because it's being weaponized and it's being used to try to pit citizens against each other, whereas we have a common problem. And so I hope that people don't fall for that. I'm sure you've heard all the like red state, blue state rhetoric on top of the, other old school divisive tactics of trying to separate people on race, gender, and what have you. I just don't want people to fall for these cliches. And I don't want people to fall for stereotypes. And one of the reasons the media has been gutted to the degree it has is they don't want people to be able to share heartfelt personal accounts of what their life is actually like in the place that's being stereotyped. They need people to believe these fake reality TV style scripted views of what fellow Americans believe and how they live. And so just, fight against that, listen to people directly. I feel hopeful because when you live in a place like this, like St. Louis, where, there's a lot of activism, there's a lot of people working very hard, and the odds are very long, and they continue to work anyway. And I think that in many ways, cities like ours are better prepared to face off a lot of challenges than kind of wealthier, more pampered kind of cities where they don't expect the worst to happen. In Missouri, you often expect the worst and you often kind of, figure out a way to, I'm not going to say enjoy it, but I just think of like the number of recreational centers in Missouri that are like, oh, this used to be a death trap mine and now it's an underground kayaking center, or like, the nuclear waste adventure trail off in Weldon Springs. It's like, yeah, it's a buried pile of nuclear waste. We're going to hike on it. Like there's this sort of like really funny, in particular to Missouri, spirit of like, well, we've been dealt the worst hand ever and, we're going to play it. Like we're going to just keep going anyway. It's like a real, kind of determination that's has this like cheekiness to it that I like. And so, I appreciate that about everybody here. And I see it in other places that are kind of run down and battered. I think the City Museum is like another example of this, where it's just industrial waste repurposed for children to play on. It's like someone thought of that. Someone had the imagination to think of that. Unfortunately, he was then murdered, because that's St. Louis. But he left behind a legacy of great ideas. And so I think we're a place that thinks outside the box. We're full of people like that. We're full of people who see, no chance in hell of succeeding, and they fight anyway because it's the right thing to do. And I think that's really good. And when I see people like that, and especially when I see young people, who've had to grow up here and witness all kinds of terrible things, just keep going. It's like a beautiful thing. I went to a concert the other night that was, all the public school students sent like kind of their top music students, and they all played in one place together. And it was this like big, beautiful, diverse crowd of kids, playing musical instruments and singing. And I was like, people just have such the wrong idea about what regular life is like here, what it's like in Missouri, what it's like in St. Louis. It's like, yes, it's full of corruption. Yes, it's full of, law-breaking officials and vicious individual citizens sometimes, but it's also full of this. And this is what we need to save, are these kind of community actions in this spirit of like, oh, you think you're taking this away from me? Well, you're not, because I'm making it myself. So tough for you, and we're good at that. A lot of fortitude. So that's where my hope lies. It's just like Han Solo said, don't tell me the opposite. You just keep going. Oh gosh. Well, I'm going on book tour. There will be a St. Louis event. I'll send you information about that in case anybody wants to come. Left Bank Books is sponsoring it. I'm not completely sure the date. It should be around April 1st, though. And I think either at the High Point or the Ethical Society. Anyway, I'll send the information to you. And I'm going all over the place, which is going to be a weird time to do that because God only knows what's going to happen between now and April. And then after that, I'm just going to try to wind down a little bit and finally take a little break and continue with the Substack. And as for a second book, I got to think about what to do in this political circumstances with this particular government and with digital technology being censored. I'm thinking about a lot about how to archive my past work, how to preserve my past work and make sure it doesn't get censored more than I'm thinking about my future work at the moment. So that's just, I don't know, something to consider. And honestly, and I'm not talking about just me personally, if you ever feel like, gosh, there are all these terrible problems, what can I do? One thing everybody needs done is just archiving. Like, we need some backup copies of the history of the last 20 years, which has been mostly recorded digitally online. And the companies themselves don't necessarily preserve it. And I worry, like what I was saying about Ferguson, that a lot of the stories of Ferguson are being lost. I worry about that with a lot of things. So if you're ever just bored, and you're interested in history, recent history, like participate in some sort of archival project or save the links yourself, enter them into the web archive, archive.org. It's a sort of simple thing to do. And if you ever feel like I'm not doing anything, which by the way, you don't have any obligation to do anything. I'm so sick of everyone saying, oh, Gen Z will save us. It's like Gen Z already went through hell. Like, leave Gen Z alone and make the actual adults have to clean up these problems. But if you want to do something useful, God knows we need more archiving. So we need to know our history, I think, to have a better future. And I'd be worried that our history is being destroyed. I would really like to, because with Flyover, it worked out great. And it having it in a print form helps preserve it. Like, again, I'm thinking about like, how do I save these? I don't know whether my current publisher would be on board with that. I mean, I would bring up the success of Flyover as an example of, yes, this can be done. They usually want something brand new from me, but it's going to be a big struggle to write a book and write the Substack. And, the Substack is what pays my bills much more than the books. So, I know where I would choose, but we'll see what happens. Hopefully they'll be amenable to that idea because I would like that. Maybe a combo, old stuff mixed in with some new stuff.